Roby Price, and welcome to my workshop.
Well, I'm just back from Knoxville, A&M Supply. Got ourselves a load of lumber in the back, plywood at 3/4 and 1/4, and a lot of maple. This is gonna be for our cabinets. So let me get this out of the truck. Come on inside, let me show you what we're up to.
Office space. Part 2, Carcass Construction, uppers and lowers.
Well, we're out of the truck and I've got my 1/4-inch plywood stacked up over here. My lumber is right behind me over there. That's for face frames and panels. And I've got my 3/4-inch out of view over there, and that is waiting to be the carcasses. Now, come on into the study. Let me show you where these cabinets are going. We're gonna focus on the floor cabinets first, and we're gonna do a little bit of a twist on those. Well, it's pretty obvious where my cabinets are going simply by the lack of plywood on the walls. We're going to cover that up. Now, we have a corner cabinet in the center and 2 more on this side, 2 more carcasses over there. On this side, I've got 7. Behind you, there's another corner cabinet and a couple on either side that way. We're going to mirror that arrangement on top with the uppers as well. Now, for the upper cabinets, I'm not worried too much about alignment. I've got a lot of control over that. For the bottom cabinets, I have to deal with the floor. There's going to be a lot of shimming on those. So what we're going to do here is we're going to separate the toe kick platform from the carcass itself. We're going to build this in 3 pieces, and behind you we've got 2 pieces. This allows me to tackle the floor problem first and isolate it, and we don't have to worry about shimming. Once we get the floor set up and leveled out, we can really make some time. So let's focus on that first, and let's get out to the shop, start making ourselves up some platforms. I've got 3 complete, so consider these prototypes. Let me go over to the workbench. I'll show you how we do this.
The bases are made out of plywood, as you would expect, and we are making those from the drop from the wall installation. These are 4.5 inches wide, and when stood vertically with a cap on top, that brings them to 5.25. You'll see that in a few minutes. When we put the carcass on top of that, the bottom of the carcass will be 6 inches off the floor, and that's where I want it. Well, I've got my 2 verticals and my 2 caps. When I put these together, they're going to act like an L-beam, and you'll see that in a minute. Let's take a measure and cut them all at the same time. That ensures that everything lines up just right.
Well, I've got my long sections cut. They're all even up, and I like the way they're turning out. But this isn't all I need to make the platforms. I have to have the horizontal, I'll call them ribs, that connect all these together. And there are 40 of those. And if you've got that many of them, you might as well make a jig to get it right.
I've made 2 marks, one of which you can see and one of which I'm using to line up a stop block. We'll secure the stop block with some 1.25-inch brads. We'll secure our jig onto the compound miter saw with the mark directly under the blade. This will give us the ability to cut all of our ribs at the same length.
Well, one of the things I like to do is I like to use the same pieces to help build the others. We're going to start off here. Got this in place. Now, one of the things that I want to do, this angle that I'm building, I want it to be fairly rigid. And we're going to get a lot of rigidity out of the screws that we put in, but this is one of the very few places where I'm going to add some glue. Now, one thing about glue is it will make it slickery, and when it does that, it has a tendency to move around on you. So on the very ends, our brad will help keep it from moving. Now, now that we're secure, I already have my marks here, and if you will take yourself a little square If you put your square right there on your mark, you can usually get the drill in the right place every time. Well, we're set up over here on my assembly table. I'm not going to call this a workbench because it's really not. I've got a steel Parsons table underneath it. Now the glass that was on this is now inside coffee table. It was cheaper to buy the unit in a garage sale than it was to have a piece of glass made for the coffee table. So that's the reason we have this. I've kept the steel base because it's always square. And for me, that works out fine. I picked up this slab from a local woodworking vendor, and I've been using it for about 20 years. Now, one thing about this, it is square. All the corners are machined up, and they're good. So we're going to use that to our advantage. I have 2 dogs along this line, and I have 2 dogs over here. That tells me that when I line this up here, that corner is going to be square. Additionally, I have another dog right here. So I know that when this all lines up and I get my ribs in place, this corner is going to be square and the subsequent corner over there will be as well. We're going to use these to help us square up our piece and to speed up our assembly process. So let me get our pieces over here and we'll start just that.
With my pre-assembled angles in place and the end caps in place, the ribs go in with just a little bit of persuasion. This will tell you that those dogs are doing a good job of keeping everything square. I have my small square set at 3/4 of an inch. That's where I want to pre-drill. Now it has been my observation that a small square, a 6-inch square, will have a 3/4 inch rule. And that will allow you to, if you will center it up on the rule, you'll be right in the middle of where you want to drill. It just takes a little bit of alignment, and that hole will be centered on your plywood every time. You will only use 1 screw to secure the bottom of these ribs. And note, that stripe you see there, that's not a split in the plywood. That's just a little bit of a defect in the plywood, and it is not structural. We have flipped our piece over, and now we're putting in a screw in the top of the flange through the rib, and we only need 1 between the top and the bottom. This is an incredibly strong joint. There is a toe kick on the end of these cabinets, and that's a custom feature, but I want to have something solid for the carcass to rest on, and that's the reason for the end plate here.
Well, all the foundations are done, and we're going to put these aside for the moment. Now we're going to start roughing out panels for the carcasses. I've set up to cut panels, a lot of panels. And because there's so many, I've gone ahead and extended my hose in the air all the way to the shop vac. And of course the electrical is tied to it. So this will allow me to move through this process pretty quickly. I've got about 8 to 10 sheets of plywood to go through to get my sides and my bottoms cut, rough cut. After that, we'll move to the table saw. Now the first cut on this is the longitudinal, and we'll do all of the longitudinal cuts, rack them and stack them, and then after that's finished, we'll come back and make the lateral cuts. We use the track saw to create the longitudinal cuts here, and I'm pretty happy with those. But now it's time to cut the laterals, and for the laterals, I'm coming over to the table saw for a couple of reasons. One, I've got a couple of dogs over here that are going to pull that thing close to the fence and keep it squared up. I really need this corner right here to stay square. And you might ask why. I've got a square there and I've got a square over there, but it's the middle piece that I'm concerned about. It's just as important. So this whole situation right here is to maintain a square edge here. So we've got our piece here, and it's a little long, but there's a couple of safety mechanisms that we're utilizing to make this cut. One, I've got a couple of rolling dogs over here. That's going to help pull this tight against the fence, and it's also going to keep this piece from sliding this way, which can cause kickback. Second, I have my riving knife in there. That keeps this part of the piece after the blade, after the cut, from engaging the teeth. That's where kickback starts. And finally, I have a support over here on the jointer, and that keeps the board up a little higher, and the zero friction surface makes it slide easy. So take it slow, take it safe. If you're not comfortable with this, go ahead and cut it with the track saw. I've done this plenty of times before, and I take it slow and easy, but I am comfortable with doing this.
One more safety feature is you, and take a look at what I'm looking at. I'm focused on the fence. That's where everything happens. As long as you're tight against the fence, you're usually in pretty good shape. My clear-cut guides do a great job of pulling that piece into the fence. Finally, my extension support really helps with stabilizing the piece and making sure that it slides through the blade evenly. With proper setup, you can make a good, clean, and safe cut.
Well, all my panels are roughed out in the back. It's time to do final dimension. And my fence over here is set to 23 3/8. That is the width of the vertical panels. We're going to cut one side on all the panels and then move the fence. The fewer times you move this fence, the more accuracy you can pump into your cuts. Now, when we make a cut, we need to mark it because we push it through, we've got a nice clean edge on one side. If we're not smart, we'll cut that same edge again and not the other. The reason I say this is I've done it before. Organization is a key element in the shop. Always mark your cuts, always know where you've been. Each of the vertical panels has a 1/4 inch rabbet in it to receive the bottom plate. Now the bottom is 3/4 inch plywood. It's not really 3/4 inch plywood though, it's 23/32. So with a 3/4 inch stack, dado stack in place, I've got a sacrificial fence here and I'm slightly bumped against it. I have a clamp front and bottom and one just over here. I want this fence to conform to my fence. I want it perfectly straight. Additionally, what I've done, I've got my 2 rollers, my hold down rollers moved in closer to the blade. So if my panel is slightly warped, I'm still being pushed down hard next to the blade to get a good 1/4 inch depth everywhere on the plate. We're going to focus on the dados in the back of the cabinets. Now those dados are there to receive the back panel. The back panel is 1/4 inch plywood, which is not 1/4 inch. That brings us to our first comment here. My dado stack is set up. I have the initiation blade, but behind that you can't see is the thinnest makeup blade I've got. And that will produce a dado that is just thin enough to take the plywood. So that's what we're going to use. I made the test cut and we're okay. Second, when you set your fence, don't try to measure it. Take a piece of plywood. This is going to be the nailer strip that goes behind the back panel. That's what sets the depth of the dado into the cabinet. Set this such that it just kisses, and then you're going to be in the right place so that when you put your nailer strip in, it's going to be flush with the back panel. So now that you've got these 2 things set, it's time to cut. But last thing to consider, once you cut the back panel, the dado for the back panel, each of those panels has a front and a back, a left and a right. You really need to consider that so when you stack your material, keep track of where it is and what it is.
There are 4 dados for the back panel. You have the 2 sides, the bottom, and you have a top panel too. It's abbreviated. It's cut into 2 sections. The section that receives the back panel is what you see there. Now that statement by itself is relatively unimportant. What is important is that I have cut the dados in all those pieces without moving the fence. That way, if they're indexed correctly to the back of the cabinet, all the dados will match. And finally, that back panel will slide in without a problem.
I'm over here at the workbench and I have set up my 2 panels here with the bottom. They're being held in place by a clamp. And overall, I think my fit up is pretty good. Now, what we have to do next is we have to get our nailers and our 2 top plates in place. The 2 nailers in the back are what go into the studs. That gives us something to screw in and attach to the wall. The 2 plates on top, they're strips 4 inches wide, just like the nailers. That's what we can use to screw into the countertop or give the countertop something to attach to. Now, we don't have a dado. Keep in mind, this plate here, it was dadoed in, and we took a lot of time and effort to get that measure just so. But at the same time, plywood's not 3/4 of an inch, and it even varies somewhat. So I will take a piece right here, and I will make a mark right here in the corner. And it is this corner that I want, because right now, these ends could come out a little bit or go in. I really didn't take any time to measure, but I've got a mark here now, so it's off to the crosscut saw. We're going to go ahead and cut this, bring it back, check it, and then we will make all of them the same length. That is what will go a long way for making the carcass square. Well, these are all the pieces for 11 carcasses. Those are the lower ones. Now it's time to start looking at the uppers. We're not going to assemble these until we've got both sets complete. This is the first of 4 sheets. This is what we're going to use to do the side panels for our upper cabinets. Now those cabinets are tall. They're 48 inches tall. And we're not going to be making any of the cross cuts for these on the table saw. There's just not enough wing on the end, and it gets a little dangerous after a while. So all those cuts, all the cuts across the plywood are going to be done here with the track saw, and we're taking some pretty special care to make sure that we're accurate. Now, the longitudinal cuts, we're going to do those on the table saw. Again, we do need the accuracy there, and the reason is this. We're at 15 3/4 inches wide. These are very deep upper cabinets, and we can get 3 sections out of this with very little waste, and the table saw will help us with that. I have my saw set at 16 inches. That's the first cut on each panel. So we'll go through all 8 panels and make that cut. After that, we reset to 15 3/4. That first panel that's 16 is recut to its final dimension. And then we cut the rest of the other larger panels, which are 32.5, at that 15 3/4. That'll give us all the measurements and all the cuts we need without resetting the fence.
Just like the lower cabinets, we have a dado in the bottom, but this one's a little different. We have the same dado in the top of the side panels for the upper carcass. We're going to use all the same techniques we did for the lower cabinet, with the addition of our extension support. That will help provide stability.
Well, I've got rabbets on both sides, and they look good. Now, this particular cabinet, as long as it is going to need some help in the middle. Things warp, things move, and you don't want them to. This is a long length to ask anything to stay true. So we will have a shelf, a fixed shelf in the middle, and we're going to dado that in. Now, this is a turning point for something this large. On my lowers, I know everything is right because I cut everything at the same time on the table saw. These panels are perfect. These were cut on a track saw, and getting everything lined out perfectly with the track and getting the dimensions set up just right, not so much. So we are out on some of these panels as much as 32nd. I think I've seen a 16th in one of them. So when we put this center dado in, we've got to be real careful. It's time to start tracking. We have to track the bottom, and we will index everything against the bottom, and there's a good reason. First of all, the bottom of these cabinets are going to be right at eye level. You're going to see that. Everything needs to line up just perfectly. That center shelf, if we decide to go with glass doors, that needs to line up perfectly with the bottom as well. Now, the top, that's pretty high up, and you're going to have crown molding that's continuous. You're never going to see the top. So we're going to let the tops run wild, and we're going to index the bottoms. That means all these are going to be marked as bottoms, and these are going to be what we measure against when we put in the middle dado.
Every time you engage a power tool, you mentally assign a risk factor to it. Now this one, we're cutting a dado in the middle of the board. This is a pretty high risk factor. There is no riving knife, and I have the full friction of the full table on the saw. So we're going to be watching this very closely as we move through. Those roll down holders, those are really going to do a good job for me here, and I need that. If you're not comfortable with this cut, which I consider the most dangerous of the project, use a router.
I've set up here to cut the dado for the back panel, and that has the initiation blade for the dado stack plus the smallest one. Now, when I was cutting dados for the lowers, I noticed that with the blade on this side, the initiation blade, this side of the cut was very smooth. The other side, with the smaller of the stack or infill blades, was not very smooth. As a matter of fact, it was pretty bad. but this was against the grain, so I was getting some tear out. So if you use this method to get something slightly less than 1/4 inch, which is the smallest you can do with both the initiation and termination blade on your dado stack, keep in mind you need to put the rough side on the outside or where you can't see it. If you don't have that option, you're better off going to a router table. Now, one more note. We have marked the bottom of our stack over here. You saw me do that. We're getting ready to pass through and put the dado in the back. I would actually encourage you to take that same Sharpie and mark the back of these as well as the bottoms. Well, all our rabbets and dados are in place, and it's time to work on the tops and the bottoms. Those are 18 3/4 by 15 3/4, and all that work is going to be done on the table saw. And it's a lot of work. There are 22 of them.
All the cutting techniques are the same as they were for the lower carcasses. We'll rough it out with the track saw, and then we'll pay careful attention for the factory square edge and make our cuts accordingly so that we can maintain that square throughout the entire sheet.
Stack is getting larger. Let me show you what we've got. I've got the side panels here. Over here, I have the tops and bottoms with the dados already cut. Back panels aren't cut yet, but that's soon. Over here, right here, this is the middle shelf. It's going to be dadoed in, and it's going to give the cabinet a lot of strength. Now this over here is interesting because I haven't spoken of it before. We're going to have a false bottom. So I have a set of bottom panels over here that are going to be in place. You're going to be able to pull this out, and in the cavity, in the false bottom, there's going to be an LED light. And we need to be able to access that in the future for wiring purposes or to change out the bulb later. So we want to be able to open that cavity up. Now, what we have left are nailer strips. We have a nailer strip on the bottom. That's about a 4-inch piece of board that fits inside the back panel. You won't see it. But we have a French cleat at the top. So when we hang our cabinets, we just put them in place and then we nail them. Come over to the table saw. Let me show you what we're doing.
Some of these nailers are 3 inches wide and some of them are 4. So we're going to just start cutting until we finish. We got about 33 of these things to make, and we're not going to attempt to get the length right now. We're just working on the width. Finally, I would point out that all the strips that I made here, that's from drop. I didn't have to cut any of my plywood sheets to get these. Save your scraps, they can come in useful. We're looking at the French cleat, and that is pretty simple. We just have to cut 2 boards at a 45-degree angle. When the boards are stacked, they don't move. The weight of the cabinet will hold them in place. Now with plywood, I don't like a real sharp edge, so we're going to leave a little bit of it flat. The only reason I would cut an entirely sharp edge on a piece of plywood would be if I was trying to make a mitered corner.
Recall that we have under cabinet lighting, and that's what this is. That's the bottom panel that fits into the upper cabinet. And of course, we'll have electrical that'll run here behind the scenes. Now, it's as simple as cutting out a hole, and you can do that with the jigsaw. I chose to use the Shaper Origin for 2 reasons. One, its onboard computer software actually allows me to create a circle the right size and center it on this panel. Second, I'm still learning how to use this tool, and this is a good opportunity. Always take an opportunity to learn how to use your tools and push your skills a little farther.
We are pre-drilling all our boards, and what you're seeing here is some preventative medicine. I am scoring this board below the level of the rabbet, so if I get tear out, that's where it stops. So when I'm pre-drilling and the drill bit pushes through, the veneer will not separate past the point of scoring. Even though you've mitigated the tear out, you need to remove the extra pieces. They will get in the way and your joint won't marry up accordingly if they're still there.
There's quite a bit more detail in the upper cabinets than the lower ones, primarily because you can see more of them. The drawers hide a lot. In these cabinets, we've got intermediate shelves between the fixed shelf, and I want them to be adjustable, so we need holes for the shelf pins.
The first step is to align our panels, label the bottoms, and number each panel, and note that the backs are lined up against each other. We'll measure 11 3/8 from the bottom of the rabbet. We'll do the same from the dado in the upper section, and we'll make a mark in the center.
And then, of
Using
course,
my longest
taking
square,
the
we'll mark the
longest
center of the
square I
line
own,
across the panel, and we'll complete that on the other side. I've made a jig that allows me to draw a parallel line on my panels. This is going to line up with where I want my shelf pin holes. Now with my lines marked, I can line up my shaper plate so that I know exactly where the center is. With the plate aligned, I program in 5 holes along the center line, and those are for my shelf pins. They're 1 1/4 inches apart, and the shaper origin will make sure that they're put in exactly the right place each time. It couldn't be simpler.
Well, if you watched the whole video, you saw me pre-drill all the holes and countersink them. And a lot of y'all might have said, use a nail gun or something else. And you know something? We could have, but there's no glue in those cabinets and they are rock solid. So I feel comfortable with my decision. And we're gonna pre-drill all these as well. All in all, it makes a stronger cabinet, and it's a little extra work up front, but I mean to tell you, they go together very, very fast if you'll just take these steps. Now, I did them all from the back side, and I can this time too, except one area. And the quickest way to do a pre-drill on a dado is to come at it from this side. That way, you make the hole and you'll countersink from the other side. It goes very fast, and it is the way to go. Another thing, you see I've got my square right here. That helps me get the hole in the right place. But there are 3 of them. That's where it's handy to have 2 squares. Again, it's all about getting this done fast. Well, it's finally time for some assembly, and we could just slap a couple of these things together and they might come out okay. But if we take the time to put ourselves together a foundation and a jig or 2, I think we'll increase our speed and accuracy. Let me show you what we've got.
You've probably already noticed that my parallel clamps are on stanchions. Those are screwed to the table, and they help keep the carcass square during assembly. I also have a square there to help me keep the first piece upright and in place. It is very difficult to make your first connection when you're fighting to keep it upright and not hitting the ground. Finally, the T-brackets sit on top of the parallel clamps. The T on the bottom is actually indexed so that when it rests hard against one of the parallel clamps, the stop on the back side will keep the first panel in the right place. All of this is to help promote a square assembly. With all these mitigators, assembly is really pretty simple. Everything goes together clean, square, and neat. And by the time I get that last little top piece in, everything is square because it was square on the table. A few clamps, and I'm ready to start screwing it together. My holes are pre-drilled, but they're only pre-drilled in the side panel, not the bottoms or the backs. That's on purpose. Because I free-handed these, I don't have total control of where they are. So I didn't want to pre-drill the bottoms or the backs either. We'll go ahead and take that same countersinking bit, and we'll pre-drill the backs and bottoms prior to putting the screws in. I would point out that a pre-drilled hole makes for a stronger screw connection than one that is not.
This is always a little finicky.
This is where you find out if your measurements are right.
Ha! That's pretty good.
I was truly expecting a little bit more of a fight. The second half of the top slips into the dado without too much trouble, and the back nailer supports it. The bottom nailer goes in the same way.
1, 2, 3. It's finally time. 1, 2, 3. We're in a position now where we can assemble the upper cabinets. All the pieces are cut. So the assembly sequence is a little bit different than the lowers, and that's primarily due to size. The lowers were only 30 inches tall, the uppers 48, and with that causes a little bit more difficulty with regards to maneuvering and manipulating the panels and getting the fit up just right. So let's come over to the table, take a look at what I've got going on as far as tools to help these things fit together, and we'll assemble one of these.
The jig has changed a bit, and that's because the piece is longer. We're going to go ahead and go lateral with the table, but the stanchions are still drilled to it, and everything is still square. I have the bottom and the side panels secured against each other, and they're pretty stable in the unit right now. Note the shims. The rabbets were just a touch deeper than they should have been, and those shims are there specifically to make sure that the pressure is on the bottom panel and not the side panel. With everything in place, we will re-drill the pre-drill and then move on to the top panel. And to be truthful, that one is done pretty much the same way. We'll install the back panel now, and this was one of the big differences in the assembly process. There was too much friction going in from the top, so we'll go in from the side and save ourselves some grief. And now it's time for the other side. If you will line up one side with the dado and just wiggle it a bit, the back panel will find its way in. It works very well, and you'll get the hang of it the more of these you do. Got a lot of clamps in place and everything's tight, and we're starting the post drill of the pre-drill. Now note the parallel clamps on top are at an angle. That's so that we can clear the drill.
We do have a front and a back, and as far as getting this in place, it is simply a matter of getting it. You can actually move those out just a touch. That's a good fit. Getting this centerpiece in can be a little difficult sometimes. Tolerances are tight. Now, this center strip right here, I think that's great. That tells me exactly where I need to drill my holes, and that made it very easy when it was time for pre-drilling. It also goes a long way for getting this lined up with the center.
The centerpiece will be secured to the side piece with a few additional screws. These are done at post-assembly. This is an afterthought, and I just felt like it was the right thing to do. The bottom nailer is installed just like the lower cabinets. No changes here. The French cleat doubles as a top nailer, and it's installed the same way as well.
Well, this carcass is complete, and this is number 5 of 13. I have 8 more to go. So I'm going to be busy for the rest of this afternoon. So we do have a couple of things left to do here that are on hold. I have a false bottom that's held up by 2 cleats right there and there. Those have not been cut, primarily because I don't know how wide the bottom of my face frame is going to be. Some of that's going to be dictated by the trim package. So again, that's on hold. Another thing I haven't done, I have not drilled a hole on either the sides or the back for the electrical that powers the LED. When I get things situated and understand how the electrical runs, I'll do it at that time. There's no hurry. So we have done uppers and lowers, and they're both a little bit different. But we've got one more carcass to do, actually 2. We've got a lower corner and we've got a upper corner. And the corner cabinets present a geometry challenge that is a little bit interesting. So we're going to do that in our next episode, and I hope you'll join me there in Roby's workshop.